Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero. I'm
heroic he comes
idiot. If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
Oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
Welcome to this episode of the Sensible Socialist Podcast. I'm super excited for this episode. With me today is Batya Ungar-Sargon, as close as that will be, I guess. She's the deputy opinion editor of Newsweek. And before that, she was the opinion editor at Forward, which is the largest Jewish media outlet in America. She's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Newsweek, obviously, New York Review of Books, Daily, and a bunch of other stuff. I think you've probably seen her or heard her recently on a number of different programs, specifically talking about her new book, Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. And Batya, thanks for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Oh man, thank you so much for having me. I really feel like there's so few of us in this space. We really have to stick together and really try to amplify the points that we're trying to make because they're so important. And I think that they should and do appeal to people on both sides of the political aisle. And so I really admire what you're doing, and I'm so glad to be here with you.
Well, awesome. That's warms my heart. But so to kind of jump into it, I think in some ways, to get a background, I know you have a PhD from Berkeley, and obviously Berkeley is an interesting place, and it's an interesting place to have gotten a PhD in terms of its former free speech position and potentially its relatively anti-free speech position now. But so I want to get a bit of a background kind of deeper in terms of just the kind of potted bio that I did. But I'd want to do that in a way that I like to do with a lot of people, which is I've heard you not as a criticism, but even somewhat timidly or as maybe an offhanded remark to say, I would consider myself a socialist. And I'm kind of curious to look at that a bit and to say, to give maybe a bit of your background by way of asking, you describe yourself as a socialist, sort of how did you come to that position, and what do you mean when you use the word socialist?
Oh, great question. So the reason that I sound sort of timid and kind of half committed when I say that is because the other people using that term, I really don't have a lot in common with them. Yeah. So to me, it is not a socialist position to ask the government and working class taxpayers to pay off $50,000 in student loans, but that is the position of the quote unquote socialists today. To me, it is not a socialist position to try to ban a job like fracking, which is a source of upward mobility for a lot of working class people. These aren't things that I would call socialism. So I don't really, I don't even think free 4-year college is a socialist position. I mean, trade school for sure, but so when I say I'm a socialist, what I mean is for every question, I am asking myself, what is the pro-working class, pro-labor position on this issue or that issue? And that is where I'm going to go with it. Now, it happens to be that America's working class is very committed to capitalism. And so when I say I'm a socialist, for me to impose on them views that are anathema to the views that the things that they want to see, that would be ridiculous and not a socialist thing to do. So that's why I sort of caveat it. What I mean by that is just a pro-worker point of view, for every issue, ask yourself, is this going to help, the Black, line painter in Georgia? Is this going to help the Hispanic factory worker in Nevada? Is this going to help the service industry person in Kentucky? That is a question we should be asking ourselves. And I think that the problem for a lot of people on the left today is that a lot of those people I just mentioned have very conservative social views. And so to me, what it means to be socialist today is to make space for those views in the public sphere. Like, that is extremely important. And instead, what you're seeing is highly educated, white liberals erasing those views from the public sphere in the name of some kind of equity. And so I'm really opposed to all of that. That's kind of what I mean by it. What do you mean by socialism when you say it?
I mean, ironically, in terms of in the critical studies, they would likely categorize me as a kind of vulgar Marxist, in the sense that I basically see the class relations in society as the economic base of our society, and the things that we see in terms of law, social, cultural, literature, school, all this kind of stuff is really a superstructure that is built on top of an economic base that is fundamentally about a division between who is able to own and control the means of production, what we produce, how we produce, what we do with the profits, and the rest of the people who essentially have to sell their labor and time for a wage. And so when I mean, to get super pedantic in some ways, socialism is to me a kind of a bigger word that really is, if you particularize it, is this transition period that you would exist in between attempting to essentially certainly discuss and be critical of the superstructure, but to really fundamentally change the economic base. And that you'd have to do that by a kind of capture of the political system, a capture of the cultural ways that culture reproduces in terms of education and stuff like that. But that the way that you do that is with a continued focus on the fundamental economic relation rather than on the aspects of the superstructure. So you should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, where you might be able to say, yes, there's obviously been a race issue and problem in America, but that what that's produced is actually a particular super oppressed aspect of an already oppressed group, which is the working class, who deals with exploitation all the time in society. And so I too agree that, I think that free college, if you look at, free college and many of the kind of things that Bernie Sanders or AOC or something like that would promote, these are what I would consider social democratic views, very common in even Latin America, Western Europe, all of Europe. Almost everywhere in the world has a kind of social democratic position, because it's a fantastic way to save capitalism and to prolong capitalism, to allow this fundamental exploitation to continue while making everybody feel like, well, God, at least I don't live in the States. And I think that's a kind of pernicious, actually, and ultimately, so you have this dual thing where it's good for some people, but I agree, a certain strata of people that are the sort of kind of people from their background who are able to go to college or something like that. But increasingly there's an elitism that comes in terms of the way that our culture and education, those things are kind of reproduced. And so I think it was such an important thing in the book that you said, look, journalism in particular, because your book is about, journalism specifically in media, that, I read the Art Fields of the world and things like that, these working class journalists who really just had to do journalism because they couldn't really find much other work, and they were literally walking on the streets with beat cops and doing those kind of things that was talking about the lives of working people. And even somebody like Jack Reed, who wrote 10 Days That Shook the World about the Russian Revolution, and a book about, or a bunch of writings about Pancho Villa, was always his focus was always, though he was from absolutely the upper class, his focus was on working class people. And he really did kind of, I think, parrot in many ways the positions of working class people, rather than attempting to kind of say, oh no, you're this kind of underclass that I just need to that I just need to get the votes, And I watched last night Don't Look Up with my wife, and there's a great line that Jonah Hill, who's the kind of Don Jr.-esque character, he's like, we need you, the working class, to help us, the super rich, against them, the teachers and the elite kind of strata that we sort of see in society. And I thought that was a great sort of parody, because that is, I think, in many ways what is going on, that there's this, that you said, a capture of the conservatism that you might see in the modern American working class, particularly the rural or non-urban working class, that has been absolutely captured by the sort of people for whom, when they get into office, or when they're actually even reproducing culture in the way that they can, are doing so to maintain the fundamental exploitation that exists in society. And so it's this, all of this is, to me, super obscuring of the kind of reality that we live in, for the purposes, even on both sides, to maintain a kind of dominance of an elite. And
I would take it even one step further, and I'm curious what you think about this. I think a lot of what is pushed by the left in terms of the expansion of the welfare state goes hand in hand with everything that you're describing.
Yep.
So instead of wanting there to be a powerful working class filled with, animated by its own autonomy, what they want is for who counts as the poor to be ever expanded, and for them to be living sort of at the beneficence of liberal governments, right, and liberal elites who are happy to pay very high levels of taxes. So the perfect example of this, of course, is AOC wearing a tax the rich dress to the Met Gala, as if that's some sort of contradiction, when everyone at the Met Gala is like, just tell me how much to pay in taxes. I'm happy to do that, right? Like that. So I think that, again, like what gets passed off as being leftist today is actually, like you said, it's just a way of keeping the fundamental structures in place and preventing what would be a robust working class from having some sort of, self-realization, from having true franchise in the sense of self-determination of their work, of their lives, real dignity, real autonomy.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, to me, what it actually sort of harkens back to is that 100 years ago, when this was still a discussion, because it's been 100 years that we've been talking about these things, and 150 years really, that there was always this question about the peasantry, the rural sort of working group, but in some ways this different relationship to the emergence of industry and the kind of industrial proletariat who works in factories, in cities, who lives in slums. There was the focus on Marx and many people was a kind of, let's focus on the proletariat. They're the ones that have this massive revolutionary potential because they were in many ways the most advanced sector of the kind of the general working class in society. They were the ones who were operating the most advanced machinery. They were the ones kind of at the forefront of like working class, even self-understanding. And the peasantry was, for almost in all commentaries, like in Russia, very much about the Tsar, very conservative in their social views and things like that. And what's happened, obviously, is that almost everywhere in the world, not totally, but there really is no more peasantry. That the peasants, the rural working class, has been proletarianized in the sense that they moved out of some kind of like weird relationship with some landlord or lord or whatever, and into this wage relationship. That what's maintained and what's happened is that there's still this conservatism of the rural working class, and even a section of the more advanced working class. I mean, you can make the argument now that tech workers and coders and this kind of even elite strata of the working class might be the proletariat of our time, in the sense of being the most sort of advanced and on the cutting edge of technology, that whose ability to control that technology or withdraw their labor from it can fundamentally like rechange society in a way that you take out Amazon Web Service and the delivery drivers, and our economy grinds to a halt. And so, but there is this massive working class people that aren't necessarily they are kind of working in a more traditional labor like situations and working class positions in factories and things like that. And so the question has always been, does the peasantry have revolutionary potential in the same way that the proletariat does? And there's been that huge debate the whole time. And the only people who've had success at actually awoking a spirit of revolution, even in people who have seemingly super conservative ideas, are the people who rejected this notion that you have to ignore them, that you just say, oh, just like they'll come with us if we just like, focus on the most advanced, that the most advanced will kind of pull the less advanced with them. And it's never been a working strategy. It's always divided societies apart. I think it's one of the reasons why the German Revolution in 1919 ultimately failed, because there was this inability to be, there's a long tradition of Blanquists. Like, we just need a few revolutionaries at the very top who can just like pull everybody together. And that never works. And what you need to do is speak the language of the people for whom you actually want to see their lives improved. And that's the case where, like, you can't run into a factory in rural Minnesota and start talking about, even critical race theory, because in one sense, it's not what's on their mind. It's not the forefront of what they think about. And in many ways, it is confusing. It makes you sound elitist, and they're just not going to listen to you. And so you have to meet people where they are. That's a principle of like organizing that goes back forever. And it's been rejected by this elite strata of activists rather than organizers. And I think there's a fundamental difference between those two.
Yeah, there's some great quotes from Lenin when he sort of realized that at the end of the day, what the working class wanted was they didn't actually want revolution. What they wanted was lives that were just slightly more like the bourgeoisie that he hated,
peace,
right?
bread, and land. Yeah.
Exactly. And like, I think that you see that a lot, like, people get very upset at Black voters for not voting for socialists. And, at the end of the day, like, they know what's right for them. They don't want a revolution, that you have to have a certain level of privilege to be attracted to the idea of burning everything down. And that's why, only 6% of Americans are progressives. And it's the most white of all of the Democratic, subgroups, because you have to have that kind of elite education to feel like, well, I'll be fine no matter what. Let's just burn everything down. But I think there is actually a way in which the cultural issues and the economic issues really do coincide. So, for example, I've been reporting a lot about unions recently, and what happens is you'll have these unions that they're made up of Democrats and Republicans. They're totally most of the workers are totally beyond partisanship.
Yeah.
They're just they just want to get along, get a good paycheck, go home to their families. But what's happening increasingly is that as the sort of the what Thomas Piketty described as that great divide between the Brahmin left and the merchant right has sort of subdivided people by college education. Now many blue collar workers, the majority of white blue collar workers for sure are Republicans and are conservatives. And what that means is that when you have a union representation, elite bringing this kind of woke language into the union, they are actually alienating the people who most need the union protections. But it's not even just about culture. So, for example, married people in America have much higher wages and earnings than unmarried people. And a lot of economists think that there's actually causality there, meaning that, if you're married, that is going to increase your earning potential rather than the other way around. And so, for example, the median income of a Black family where the parents are married is $62,000 a year, which is much higher than for an unmarried couple. And the median income for an American, for a married couple, is $90,000 a year, which is much higher than the average. Yeah. And so what you actually have here is highly educated liberals, many of them very affluent, all of them married, right? All of them reaping the benefits of this sort of cultural institution that has economic benefits, are going out there into union settings, into places where there are workers who need the protections of unions, and pushing things like Black Lives Matter, which is opposed to the nuclear family, and all sorts of trans agenda adjacent ideas that to working class people sound like they are in tension with family values and marriage. And this is, I guess the point I'm trying to make is like, this is not just a cultural issue. This is actually, like, they know at an intuitive level. They may not know the studies and the data, but they know at an intuitive level, and they look around their church that the married couples are doing better, that the married couples are more stable. And then you have these liberals coming in like ostensibly to help them, right? And they're actually demonizing the thing that would help them economically. You get what I'm saying? So I feel like in a way we're sort of in this trap where the partisan divide is actually coming for one of the last remaining nonpartisan places in America where working class people can use that nonpartisanship, can use their unity as workers to improve their lots. And it's sort of destroying that with this cultural stuff that actually has a huge economic impact. What do you think of that?
Well, it brings it opens up the space for someone who is a Republican sort of operative in some ways to come into that situation and to say, dude, these people are talking about all this crazy stuff. We just want you, like, we think it's right for you to go against authority or, the elite or whoever, this kind of, not sure who the elite is, but always this elite, because there is a long stream of, especially now conservatism, especially when a Democrat's in the White House, not as much when a Republican is, but Democrats have been in power for the majority of the 20th century, right? So like the Democrats in many ways are a symbol of kind of elite authority. And so if you're engaged in a struggle against your immediate authority figure, your boss, and someone comes in and says, yeah, you got to join us in the struggle against the elite, period. that is actually a strategy that socialists have used 100 years ago, in the sense of saying, we don't want to merely focus on your particular economic struggle. Yours is important, and we want to fight for yours. But this has got to connect to the larger struggle of the working class generally against the owners in society. And so we've got to combine these together. And so this political process of saying, we're in solidarity with you, need to be in solidarity when the next one comes, and when the next one comes, and eventually we're going to build it up, even in that in industrial workers of the world perspective, that we're just going to create one big union that's able to do everything that we need to do. That's been that spoke to the language of the people who were in that struggle in a way that wasn't some kind of foreign idea, or wasn't this notion that we're like destroying what we understand as like a traditional way of life that's been established by a long period of cultural, social, economic, political development. Instead, we're saying, let's find the levers that we can pull, and those are political and economic. Let's focus on those, and to move into even the social sphere. I mean, I think it's, even my perspective, I mean, I will not dubiously, but sometimes like to make more right-wing people's brains melt a little bit, to say I'm a libertarian socialist, in the sense that I am libertarian when it comes to whatever you want to do. If you want to get married, get married. If you want to be polyamorous, be polyamorous. But I'm not going to push that agenda. I don't care. Do whatever you want. But what I do care about is whether or not you have the ability to control what you do at your job, and what you do in your life, and what you do in your community. And I want to be able to create a kind of democratic opening that you'll be able to genuinely participate in society in a way that we don't now, even if I can get into a polyamorous situation, or that my trans friend can access gender reassignment surgery. Those are all fine for those people who want to do that. But they don't need to be this massive agenda that is the political focus. What our political focus should be is capturing power so that we can decrease the power that economic elites have in the society to create cultural institutions, and to maintain what Antonio Gramsci called cultural hegemony, this notion that's been completely distorted in the critical theory from a kind of specific Marxist critique of how ruling class people, essentially owners and controllers of the means of production, perpetuate cultural norms and sort of common sense that maintains itself, into this notion that it's actually the maintenance of these differentiated things like patriarchy and even transphobia, or what, like all these kind of things. These are, again, to kind of go back to the vulgar Marxism, these are superstructure issues that if you actually focused your energy politically and economically on the base, you can deal with. But I take the position that racism, homophobia, these social ills are actually a byproduct of a fundamentally oppressive relationship that rests at the foundation of our society. And in that sense, that dealing with that foundational aspect is a necessary, though not sufficient, condition to be able to actually fundamentally address those. So just as the way that diversity, equity, and inclusion has essentially become part of the corporate lexicon and been a way to sort of whitewash or blackwash, or whatever you might want to say, corporate policies that are extractive and destructive economically and ecologically and all these kinds of things, is really an example of the fact that if you don't wrestle with the base of the society, even what seems like superstructure issues can be subsumed by that economic base and used towards its advantage. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's what actually is like super problematic about like this whole notion of wokeism. And I know it's probably annoying for you to have to do, but there is a million definitions of what that word means, and I know you have a particularized version, and so I want to make sure that we are speaking clearly when we talk about what wokeism is. But I do think that this notion that that what we need is to change corporate policies and to engage in like anti-racism training at corporate retreats is really not fundamentally addressing the underlying problem of racism, as it said, because I think racism is a construct that it was essentially a byproduct of a class division in society that said, ooh, a permanent and persistent underclass that can divide the working class. Perfect. This is a perfect strategy.
The color line was created after Bacon's Rebellion, which I'm sure you know, right? So the color line, making it illegal to intermarry and making Black people fundamentally in a lower status, happened after a group of indentured white servants and Black slaves bonded together in Virginia to try to overthrow the government. And the government and the local elites became so terrified at the idea of solidarity between the unfree that they created this color line to make sure that that would never happen. And Barbara Fields has this amazing line in an essay she writes about the South and about slavery, where she says, you would think from the way people talk about it that the main export of the South during the slave years was white supremacy instead of cotton. And I think that that gets exactly to what you're talking about, where, you know, we fundamentally misunderstood the cause and the effect. And if we misunderstood, the stakes are incredibly high, because if you misunderstand the thing that's causing the effect, you're never going to solve it. And I think you really saw this with the, there was this murderer who killed a bunch of Asian sex workers. Was it 6 months ago, a year ago in Atlanta? And there was this sort of drive to call him a white supremacist. And it came out that he was a deeply sick person who was religious. He belonged to a sort of cult that was an anti-sex cult, and he had frequented these sex parlors and had sex with these women, and then he murdered them out of this sick rage at himself and at that, whatever. It was like a deep act of misogyny, but it was not white supremacy. He was not motivated by race at all. And it was so interesting because he was interviewed by the police, and the police officer was reporting to the press what he had said. And he said, you know, he said that he killed them because he had sex with them, and sex is against the rules of his religion. But if he was not motivated by racism. And there was this huge backlash against him from all of these sort of, you know, liberal blue check marks. And they were saying, oh, like we should believe him that he's not racist. And it was like, okay, this guy just admitted to killing 5 women. And you think he's lying about being racist, meaning in your mind, it's worse to be racist than to be a murderer. Like, he would have a harder time admitting that he was racist than admitting that he was a murderer. And that, to me, at that moment, I was like, that is really, there's such a fundamental sickness in how we see things. Like, of course, racism is like one of the worst things you can be, is to discriminate against someone based on their skin color, especially in America, where we have such a horrible past. We've still not made up for. I'm a big proponent of reparations. We still have areas where we struggle with systemic racism. We absolutely have to be very laser focused on those things. But the idea that a murderer would have a harder time admitting to being a racist than admitting to be a murderer, it's like, you see that there's really like that has been elevated to a level beyond all proportion, and in a way that, you know, you will never be able to address the actual remaining areas of systemic racism if you are focused on the wrong things, like having a Black Fed chair, you know what I mean? Having more people of color in the elites, like, because that of course begs the question of what about everybody else? And of course our elites are too white. It's disgusting. Like, they, you know, it puts the lie to the meritocracy, right? You look around and everybody in position of power is white. Like, you know, this, like, you know, the system's rigged, right? And we want that more diverse elites. But of course, what that does is it lets them off the hook for being so far above the vast majority of Americans. And I'll just make one more point, which is that, you know, one of the questions I sought to answer in my book is, so much of the ideas that are these kind of woke ideas about race and gender, they do not reflect the views of 90% of Americans. They really are the views of the top 10% of liberal elites, people who have gone to these, you know, fancy colleges where they've been taught ridiculous ideas like that it's racist to want a colorblind society, you know, that kind of thing. And but they are the entire media has become the liberal media. Everything that isn't Fox News and conservative, you know, talk radio has been totally subsumed by these ideas, such that to speak against them is taboo at this point, right? And I wanted to answer that question. How was it that the top 10%, that this teeny tiny elite, you know, has managed to capture the media that's supposed to represent at least 50% of Americans? You know, okay, they've given up on saying, you know, we're for everybody. You know, 91% of people who read the New York Times now are Democrats, right? Like, that doesn't happen by accident, right? Like, they've given up on pretending to be for everybody, but okay, at least for the 50% or the 40% that are, how is it that such a tiny percentage has managed to capture the entire media, you know? And I think that that's a really important point to make. Just like these are not the views of like middle class people, working class people, they don't have these views. They're very counterintuitive. They're built out of this kind of postmodernist mumbo jumbo where you have to, left is right and right is left. And the thing you least expect to be true is the thing that is actually true, right? Like that kind of the Derridian, Foucauldian, like the reversal, right? That postmodernist reversal. And those views do not represent where most Americans are at. And I think that the outsized power that a teeny tiny elite has, and that they think they should have more power, like they think they should be, running everything like that. That is why I think it's really not just a threat to like a more equitable society like what you and I want, but really a threat to democracy at all.
So to the way I hear that is I agree. I think it is, this whole thing is an absolute threat to our sort of existing society. And so, because, I am this vulgar Marxist, I live and I enjoy this sense of contradiction. And the contradiction that comes with that is that I do fundamentally think that our society needs a fundamental, and dare I say, revolutionary change. Now, what I mean by revolutionary change is not actually burning everything down, but what I mean is actually, in some ways, fine-tuningly adjusting a few different things that would allow us to stand on top of where we've been rather than to burn it to the ground and start from anew. Because I don't think we need to start anew. We just need to, in some ways, realize what the promises of liberalism were 100 to 200 years ago: liberté, equalité, fraternité, and maybe solidarity, which is, of course, what they put on the back of the yellow vests that they did, and that there was, and there's a commentary you can make about the yellow vest, but at least this notion that like we're really talking about the same kinds of ideas, and we live in a society that professes a certain set of values that doesn't in any way live up to it. And I think one way that you can see even postmodernism generally, but the results of 40 to 50 years of postmodernism infecting the sort of university system and creating, moving away from vulgar Marxism and into neo-Marxism or just the critical studies
critical
in general.
Theory, You're not allowed to say cultural Marxism. That's another thing they do, because the guy who came up with that phrase was a raging anti-Semite. And so now anybody who uses that phrase is like verboten on the left. And it's like, they do that a lot, right? Like they'll take the idea of like the word globalist, which, or cosmopolitan, right? Like, people use that word to talk about Jews in a way that was anti-Semitic. But, at the same time, clearly something is happening where people are anti-nationalist, anti-patriotism, and they've made it verboten to criticize that by sort of saying like, oh, anyway, sorry, go on.
That's okay. So, but this effect of having the elite in society further and further be disconnected from the rest of the base is, when you look at the history of revolutions, particularly sort of modern post-feudal revolutions, this is a common activity. This is actually a sign of a sort of decadence and degradation that happens at the same time. And so, obviously Louis the 16th was highly, in his court, and the Tsar Nicholas and the Kaiser, and I mean, King George, and these were people that were well disconnected from the actual base and sort of growing political actors in society who like, it was just obvious to them that they were so disconnected because they were really living in a different world. What we're experiencing is the disconnection in our society not being in the old sense, in the feudal sense of thinking that God has put me in this position, and so everything I do is justified by God's will or something like that. What we're seeing is the postmodern version of elites doing what elites do, which is finding every lever and every mechanism they can to stay in power. If that means that they have to cater to a certain very small group that has outsized economic power, they'll do so, right? The sort of upper crust of the working class that doesn't even feel associated with the rest of the working class, because though they sell their labor for a wage, they might sell their labor for a wage which provides them a level of comfort that the rest of the working class doesn't actually get, and they can pay off their student loans where a certain amount of people like literally can't and won't buy houses because of it and stuff like that. So there is this disconnection, and it is in many ways, to me, only likely going to persist. And it's important to be able to call it out and to be able to have voices like yours that are able to say like, hey, this is a problem, because it's fundamentally like misrecognizing the reality that people are living in and the perspective that they have because of that reality. But it does set us up for what I would consider to be potentially, not always, there's two ways, like, and again, this vulgar Marxist sense, there's two ways that revolutionary moments go. They either go to the general ruin of society, this is the fall of the Roman Empire, or a progressive moment in which there is a movement forward in realizing something like human liberation, human emancipation, or something like that. And so as we continue to see our society divide in these very problematic ways in which this upper crust of an elite is just not speaking the same language as the rest of us, there will be the question of there will be the necessity for genuine working class actors in that society to speak on behalf of the actual working class. And I think those people will come about. They will become voices. They will be limited by the means by which they have. You know, a newspaper used to be at some point very easy to print. Like you just needed a printing press and you could do it. Our media system, and I'm curious about this because your book is about media. The media system is highly constrained. So the vehicles that we've had this euphoric kind of moment in the sense of podcasts growing and social media growing, that, oh, the gatekeeping function that media used to have is kind of broken down because anybody can post on Twitter and anybody could in principle like read it. The problem is that again, just like liberty, equality, fraternity, this notion of like free access to information that the internet provides is highly, highly controlled by internet service providers, social media companies in terms of terms of service, and then the big one being algorithms, in the sense that the goal of the organization is not to promote speech, it's to get your eyeballs on there for as long as possible to show you an advertisement because that's how you make money, or to pull your data in terms of how you actually work, like how you engage in society. And so I'm curious, I guess, to your position. I mean, it does seem like most of your book is kind of focused on what we might call liberal mainstream media, but there is this other aspect of the role and potentially there's this, like, again, contradiction of the potential liberatory role of something like an open social media and the reality of the fact that it's a highly controlled, constrained, and even censorship-based kind of system. And so do you see, but obviously woke voices are popular on these social media voices, or anti-woke voices in some ways, but wokeism is the subject that seems to be talking about all the time. And so how do you see like social media as in its relationship to this promotion of the idea that this disconnected minority having this outsized voice as compared to the non-crazy, I would say, or more rational working class?
Well, so I think I see things through that class lens again. So I think like, like all the working class people I know are on Facebook, and none of the journalists I know, including myself, are on Facebook. Like there was sort of this mass flight. I left because when it was clear with the Chinese, they were mining the data and whatever. But like, I regret that now. That was such an elitist move. Like, oh yeah, I can live without Facebook. I'll get my message out on Twitter, right? And of course, all the journalists are on Twitter, like driving the news stories and whatever. And then you look at who's doing well on Facebook, and it's always Ben Shapiro. Like he's always got 7 out of the top 10 stories that were shared, engaged with, commented on Facebook. It's always conservatives. And again, you see that divide where the conservatives are speaking to a working class audience and the liberals are speaking to other elites. In fact, tiny elites, like all of the liberal media outlets are speaking to the top, they're all trying to get the same, 8 million progressive white readers, coastal readers. And that's why all the content is so similar. It used to be that you had all these different liberal outlets and each was catering to its own different section, like you said, because of the sort of constraints of digital media and also the rewards of digital media. They all now cater to the same people with the same woke language and the same terminology and to try to get that Google search.
And mainstream media just in many ways is commenting on what's going on in Twitter. It's not uncommon to see an article that's just like, the internet erupts, and then it's just like this, that's the most annoying fucking thing.
Every news outlet has somebody whose job it is to mine the trending topics on Twitter and then write stories about it, because then it will keep that momentum going. You'll get all of those clicks. And, that sounds democratic, but it's actually not, because something like 10% of tweeters produce over 90% of all tweets, and the people who are on Twitter are much more affluent, much more white, much more coastal than the rest of the nation. And that's where all of the news attention is focused. So, to me, I don't see how. I'm the only op-ed person I know who's actually publishing working class voices. You never see people who are not college educated, who are not have big social media followings, who are not from fancy institutions. Like actually hear their voices except being mediated through some woke New York Times reporter who's going to call them racist, right? You just don't see. I mean, you see it on Fox News. They have small business owners on all the time. They have working class people commenting, but they, of course, don't care about their economic fortunes. They're catering, to the economic fortunes of the merchant elite, right? The merchant right, like the elites on the right. So I think, but they're not insulting their values. And like the idea that there's going to be any kind of working class or labor revolution without conservatism as it's beating heart is a fantasy. I mean, you look at the people who are doing the unionization efforts like in Bessemer or even at Starbucks, and they're all highly educated college people who this is their college job, right? Like AOC was a bartender, right? Like I was a waitress, like after college while I was figuring out what my next move was going to be. Like these aren't people who are going to be working side by side with the working class for the rest of their lives. And the idea that there's going to be some kind of revolution that's led by highly educated, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, University of Chicago educated people on behalf of the working class that's telling them that they're racist for wanting a colorblind society and that there's no difference between men and women. It's just a fantasy, and it's just a way of perpetuating the economic status quo from a position of like the best intentions, and so that's kind of the hardest part about it is that none of these people are cynical. They all really think that they're sort of, doing the right thing and making the world a more just place. And so I guess I disagree with you about that. I don't see any pathways for somebody, I see pathways for like what I think we should be doing, which is what I'm doing as a lefty, is supporting and elevating people like Orrin Cass and Josh Hawley and Marco Rubio, who are talking about workers' rights from the Republican Party. It's like making them, amplifying their message and their voices, because they are the people who are going to be able to speak for and to the working class in a way that AOC never, ever will.
But how would you respond to the pushback on that of saying, well, look, these are people who are using these working class positions that they.
What does that mean? Like Trump? Okay, Trump, right? Yeah. Trump, the most narcissistic human probably to walk the planet, right? Doesn't care about anybody but himself. Like very self-involved, was extremely good for the working class. I don't care what was in his heart. I care that he got rid of NAFTA and waged a trade war with China and did a whole bunch of other crazy stuff like close the border that no one would have had the guts to do. And he did because he's crazy and because he's not a good person. What do I care why he did it? He made them feel seen. And like, to me, it's sort of like, when people are who we are claiming to represent are telling us what they need and what they want, our job is not to be like, that makes you a racist, or he didn't really mean it, or he's using you. They know if somebody's using them, like they're,
But I think it's even, to me, like in terms of my experience of talking to like, quote unquote real people, because that is a conversation I get all the time as somebody with a podcast and something that's like, well, how many times do you talk to a real person? And like, I'd like to think that I do, relative, it's been more difficult because of COVID, because I can't just like go and mill about or whatever. But in general, like even on this podcast, like, I try to have people who I think are having, even that have a bigger audience like you, but I'll talk to like the random dude who reaches out to me on Discord or something, right? It doesn't matter, because I want to talk to regular people about their positions. And I think to me, it's been this case where there's a, especially again in this kind of contradiction thing of being able to kind of see the both sides of something, where you can say, look, yeah, Trump had some good policies when it came to helping, helping people. I mean, and even the vaccine is something that we should all be giving Trump a significant amount of credit for. And so there's an irony in the fact that like conservatives tend to be against it or whatever, because that doesn't fit the normal way in which in which elites tell us that we should understand how people think and vote and whatever. So because they're wrong, like Nate Silver is wrong. But I think what we can do is that you can basically say, you have a lot of people who in some sense are supporting good working class, like pro-working class positions. And we need to support that and say that's a good thing. And that we should encourage, Democrats who might be, because it's so tribal, to be against that simply because it's a Republican point, right? To say that's ridiculous and you shouldn't need that. And so, but at the same time, we can say, while Trump did important things like for the working class, there's also this other aspect of him that is a member of the elite, a member of like the high bourgeoisie, the very height sort of the bourgeoisie, and was also able to manipulate systems in terms of political organizations and Congress in particular to be able to pass a massive tax cut. And so you have that was disproportionately like helpful to rich people. And so we have to have this ability to say both sides, the Republicans and the Democrats, are hypocrites on sort of everything. And so they will, in my view, right, I'm highly skeptical of almost anyone who's in power, up to AOC, to Marco Rubio. I don't care, because I think that, one, the bridge to power right now is usually stamping on working class faces. And then once you're in power, doing what is actually doing the bidding of the people for whom you actually feel got you into office, which was not the people who voted for you. That's the means to get there. The way that you got those people to vote for you was to flood airwaves and to do all this kind of stuff, which comes through the contributions to your campaign. And obviously there's an outsized influence in terms of who's funding campaigns and who's like actually voting for people, because those are two major different things. And so you can have a situation where you have somebody like Trump, who in some senses is pro-working class and in other senses is pro-business class or pro bourgeois. And so we have to just the position I would take is that the honest position is to say Marco Rubio has some good positions on working class issues, and he's got some abysmal things for the working class. And so Marco Rubio is a complex character, because what's happened, I think, in media many times and just in the general discourse is that we have these ridiculously simplistic views on people, positions, ways that the government works, and all this kind of stuff, as if because there's only two parties, that this idea that there's just one or the other and they're both like purely representative of some things. And it's just not. The situation is deep and complex and very difficult to tease out, which is why if you want to have a 30-second soundbite on a 140 character tweet on Twitter or a 30-second soundbite on a mainstream media outlet, you have to dumb it down to this very simplistic and ultimately untrue dynamic that it's either or. It's not. It's both and.
Yeah, I don't think any politician should be. I think you have to be a sociopath to become a politician, honestly. So I definitely don't think we should be elevating politicians in some sort of like spiritual way. Like, no, you should go to church and go to synagogue and find your spiritual leaders there for sure. So we're agreeing. I just meant like, making it possible for Democrats to partner with, so for example, Sherrod Brown is partnering with Marco Rubio's investigation into Amazon practices, right? But Sherrod Brown is a massive centrist, right? Like it's amazing that Rubio couldn't go to AOC to do this. And maybe he didn't even try. Maybe she would have, right? I don't know what's going on behind closed doors. But it is very interesting that somebody who's sort of considered a moderate Democrat is the one who is now pushing this investigation into Amazon. And it really does seem to sort of beef up the idea that, Amazon and the Democrats are quite tight, and, via this whole posting the Black Lives Matter banner instead of doing anything, to protect workers' rights.
Or that Tucker Carlson is just a shill for corporations, because he's pushed back against media censorship and even on Amazon and stuff like that. And so, and these characters are Tucker Carlson, the idea that you have this like blanket statement that he's just like a white supremacist dog whistler, right, is such a simplistic it misunderstands the entire situation, because you can be both and. You can be in support of an elite and still be critical of the way at least part of the elite maintains their elite status.
I honestly think that the reason Tucker gets so much pushback is because he's the only person talking about class consistently. His monologue every night is about class and the class divide. And so they have to smear him as a white supremacist, just like it's considered now a dog whistle to bring up economic anxiety in Trump voters, So I think those things often go hand in hand. When you see like a hysterical overreaction, calling somebody a white supremacist, dig a little deeper and you'll find somebody addressing class. Even Trump himself he made the working class feel seen. Like he was their tribute, and he was their finger in the eye of the elites who hate them. And the elites really do hate them. And something that I think is very much true about America today is, the left thinks that everybody on the right is racist, and the right thinks everybody on the left has contempt and looks down on them. And one of those things are true. And it's not that the right is racist, right?
Totally, yes. So as a final kind of parting thing, you are entering into a conversation that a number of different people are having and have a number of different perspectives on it. And the thing I liked about yours, and why I honestly reached out to you rather than reaching out to John McWhorter or something like that, is because there is that yours is a kind of class focused analysis. It's this idea that this whole movement is abandoning the working class. It's not speaking their language. It's miscommunicating, and ultimately, I mean, I would say that it's a representation of the sort of decadence and excesses of postmodern thinking. That it becomes a world in which we are literally post fact because we have no grounding in like the reality, because people are existing in a world in which they don't have any kind of economic issues or anything like that. And so I know I've heard like Elon Musk recently called it a mind virus and something like that, right? And so there's these different perspectives on what this wokeism thing sort of means. And I wonder, maybe in like, obviously I've said that concision is bad, but in a sort of quick way, where do you see, I mean, I know you come from a religious background. I don't come from a religious background. And so understanding wokeism as a civil religion, to me, if you don't add a kind of baggage to it, which I think John does, then it is a kind of way of understanding the way it is represented, or at least the character it has, in which there are kind of dogmatic positions and there are heresies and those kinds of things, in terms of, if you want to say it that way. I think John obviously talks about it negatively because he doesn't like religion, but so, and that seemed like what your criticism was of it. So I don't know if there's a way, if maybe I'm oversimplifying that.
No, not at all. I think that I admire him so much. I think his work is so important, but I do think he's very elitist. I think that, you know, hating on religion is very elitist, and I don't think that just because I'm religious. You know, I was raised very religious, and then I was very secular for many years, and then I came back to it. I came back to it. My return to it went with my understanding of how class was playing a role in the way that highly educated people talk about religion. It is disgusting. It's just another form of class bigotry to act like believing in something spiritual or needing community or whatever. Like the people who need that are the people whose lives aren't amazing, you know, are the people whose lives who are not, like you said, totally divorced from any kind of economic anxiety. Those are the same people who need humor, which is another thing that the left has sort of put the kibosh on. And,
yes.
You know, Yanis Papas made this really good point, which is like, who needs jokes? It's people whose lives are terrible, like people who don't have like a life that's completely divorced from any kind of economic need. People can go on Amazon every single day and order anything that they want. Like, those people are the ones who don't need humor, and they're the ones who are making humor and making religion into signs of bigotry or signs of, like, you know, some sort of moral degeneracy. So I do think that there is a kind of elitism, and it's like, having been woke, right, and having been religious, I can tell you that, like, they don't feel anything alike at all. Like, being religious just does not feel that way. You don't experience dogma in the way that woke people enforce wokeness. Like, religion is all about grace and all about forgiveness and all about holding yourself to a higher standard than you hold others, and all about finding yourself wanting and striving to be a better person, and asking others to make sure that you're doing right by them. And it's just, it doesn't feel like that at all. Like, it, and you have a relationship with God, and at least in the Muslim Judeo-Christian religions, God has a great sense of humor. And, you know, there's just none of that in the woke culture. I just don't recognize anything from, you know, an example I often give is, like, when I was a little girl, like, I remember sometimes on Shabbos, I would flick the lights just to see if God was going to kill me. But when I was in my wokest, you couldn't have paid, if you put a gun to my head and told me to say the N-word, I wouldn't have done it. And I think, I mean, I still would never say it, but I think that there's that is very telling. Like, even now, I guess I'm more woke than religious, because, like, even now I could probably, I don't think I could bring myself to say the N-word if you put a gun to my head. Yeah. But, you know, my religious, you know, I am in a religious relationship with a spiritual creator who has a great sense of humor and will forgive me if I sin. And so I think that there's sort of, it just, like, anyone who's been religious will tell you it doesn't feel anything like that. And the people who practice religion that way, they're perverting religion. And there, of course, are, you know, people who are like that, who are mean like that or evil like that, or don't believe in forgiveness, don't hold themselves to a higher standard, who use religion to justify, you know, gross stuff. But to me, that's a perversion of religion. So that's sort of my
yeah. And the little quip on that is that sometimes it's been the case that the most committed and dogmatic Marxists tend to be former Roman Catholics, because it is one of those things where it's just you just like, oh, just replace, like, the scripture with capital and you'll be good to go. And so it's something that can infect a lot of different things. And I mean, so the question is, do you have your bullshit detector really finely tuned? And if you do, the ability to cut through dogma, whether that's religious or social, cultural, philosophical, anything, is really important. And so being able to, continue to have that bullshit detector refined is going to be able to allow you to see through wokeism, see through even the hypocrisy of politicians who are paying lip service or serving other masters. You can be able to do this in a way that is still speaking the language of somebody else that, that is working in a factory, because they've got bullshit detectors too. And if you don't think they do, then you're just infantilizing them.
Yeah.
So, Batya, I really appreciate you coming on and talking to you. I think that your book is by far the best in this discussion of wokeism and its consequences. And so, I think I would, obviously encourage everybody to read it. And, I would love to, be able to talk to you again about the working class voices that you are elevating, because I think that that's also, maybe for you, it's God's work, right? It's doing God's work. So I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you for doing this and for having me. It's been really a pleasure talking to you.
Awesome. Well, I'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
All right. Bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sensible Socialist Podcast. This podcast is supported by listeners like you, and no advertisements or anything will ever be said. If you want to support the podcast, please go to patreon.com/sensiblesocialist and give today. Also, please give us a review or a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast, as it greatly helps. All right. See you next time.